Hey friends, it's Laurie. Today I'm sharing 15 of my favorite fall DIYs. I used mostly Dollar Tree supplies. I really hope you enjoy them, so let's get busy. I'm starting my blessed pumpkin by using this wooden cutout from the Dollar Tree. I removed the hanger and the little bow, and using my white acrylic paint, I gave it a complete coat. Now that it's dry, I'm going to accent it with my pencil. I'm rubbing it along the side and the edges of the pumpkin, and then just kind of rubbing the pencil in with my finger. I worked my way around the pumpkin, adding on the pencil, and then rubbing it in. But if you prefer to have a completely white pumpkin, just skip this step. Now that it's finished, it's time to embellish it. For the pumpkin stem, I'm just using an old flat stick and I'm attaching it with my E6000. I'm first adding on some hot glue and then following it up with my E6000. The hot glue will help it set quickly and the E6000 will help hold it permanently. To accent my pumpkin, I'm using some of these fall leaves along with one of these pretty sunflowers from the Dollar Tree. I'm also using some of these small sunflowers. I had them left over from a past project and I had picked these up at the Dollar Tree as well. I snipped off some of the leaves and now using my glue gun, I'm attaching them to the pumpkin. With those in place, I'm now attaching on the sunflower. And now using my glue gun, I attached on the 4 little sunflowers. These are the colors that I chose for my pumpkin, but you can always change them up to fit your home decor. As a filler accent, I'm adding in some of this Dollar Tree fall grass. And once again, I just used my glue gun and accented around the top of the pumpkin. With those all in place, I'm now adding in another fall leaf. And I attach this right next to the sunflower. I always love adding in pops of green, so I'm adding in some leaves from this ivy stem. And once again, I used my glue gun and just kind of randomly placed them around the flowers and the leaves. I'm using this faux leather bless sign from the Dollar Tree and I'm painting it with my barn red paint. Now that it's dry, I'm using my E6000 and attaching it to the front of the pumpkin. To stand my blessed pumpkin up, I glued 4 of the tumbling tower blocks together, 2 sets, and I painted them white. I added some hot glue along with my E6000 and attached both to the back of the pumpkin. The hot glue holds them in place while the E6000 sets them up permanently. And this pretty blessed pumpkin is complete. To make my home sign, I'm using one of the 18-inch wooden plank signs from the Dollar Tree. And because I'm going to paint it, I removed the hanger, and then using my white acrylic paint, I gave the front a complete coat. I let my sign dry completely, and now using my pencil, I'm going to give it a smoky edge. I'm rubbing the edge of the pencil along the edge of the sign, and then rubbing it in with my finger. I'm continue adding the pencil around the outside of the sign and rubbing it in, and this step is completely optional. I'm giving my sign a bit of a rustic look, so this just kind of adds to the vibe. I'm adding the word home to my sign, and I'm using the letters H, M, and E. I picked these up at Michael's. They're 3-inch wooden letters, and they're about a ½ inch thick. I used my black acrylic paint, and I gave each of them a coat. I let my letters dry completely, and then, because I want to give them a bit of a rustic look, I used an old piece of sandpaper, and I started rubbing around the outside edges of each letter. If you're looking for a cleaner, crisper sign, then I would just leave the letters plain black and omit this step. Now that I have my letters complete, I'm going to make the O for my sign. Getting started, I'm recycling a small canning ring and lid from some past preserves. My canning ring will be completely covered, but I'm giving it a coat of yellow spray paint just in case something shows through. The lid is going to be completely exposed, so I'm giving it a coat of this nutmeg spray paint. And this is how they'll look when they're sprayed. To wrap my canning ring, I'm using some of this yellow cotton blend fabric that I had on hand. I'm going to use about 30 strips of fabric, and I'm cutting them 9 inches in length and 1 inch in width. And while I was cutting my strips, I was trying to be careful, but if they were a little off here and there, it's not going to matter when you're adding them onto the ring. To add the fabric on my ring, I'm taking one strip and making sure that both of the ends match up. I'm then placing the loop inside the ring and pulling the 2 pieces of fabric through it. Now that my first is in place, I'm following the same instructions, and I'm continuing to add the loops onto my ring, making sure to pull them tightly and push them up snugly next to each other. I continued working my way around until I had all 30 attached. I'm working on a small canning ring, but if you want to make a flower with the larger ones, you'll definitely need more strips of fabric. Now that I'm done, and this is pretty much looking like a hot mess, but we're going to clean it up by trimming off the ends of the fabric. I'm matching the 2 ends of the fabric together. I'm folding them in half and then cutting down towards the center at an angle. I continued working my way around the ring until I had turned all the fabric ends into petals. Now that I'm done, you can see where I had looped the fabric on, so I'm going to turn the flower over and pull all the petals to the front. To give the center of my sunflower a little accent, I'm using some black acrylic paint, and I'm just placing it on the end of a paintbrush, and then with another paintbrush, I'm tapping against it and giving it a splattered effect. When I was done, I let it dry, and because sometimes it's easy for the paint to scrape off of metal, I like to give mine a coat of Mod Podge. While that's drying, I'm going to add on my hanger, and you can replace the original one. I want mine to be a little bit longer, so I'm cutting about 18 inches of the Dollar Tree jute. I fed it through the 2 original holes and then tied a couple of knots on the back. I then added on a dot of hot glue to each knot to help hold it in place. Now that the center is dry to attach it to the flower, I'm adding in some hot glue and then attaching it in place. To add the letters and the flower to my sign, I'm first finding their placement. I'm now using my E6000 and attaching them all in place. To finish up, I'm adding a piece of buffalo check ribbon that I had on hand. I'm adding it to the hanger and making a simple bow. And with that, my sunflower home sign is ready to hang. If you're new to my channel, please consider clicking on that little red subscribe button below and leaving me a thumbs up. To all my returning friends, you know I'm always so happy to see you. I'm starting my mini scarecrow by using one of the foam dice from the Dollar Tree, and you can use any color that they have. It won't matter because we're going to be painting it. I'm using a khaki tan color, but choose any color you'd like. To make it easier to paint, I'm using one of the wooden skewers from the Dollar Tree and I'm just sticking it into the bottom. Now using my paint, I'm giving it 2 complete coats. With my dice dry, I'm using a pencil and I'm going to roughly sketch out 2 ovals for the scarecrow's eyes. I'm now using my paint pen to outline them and fill in the centers, and you can always use paint or even a permanent marker. To accent the eyes, I'm using some white acrylic paint and I'm painting 2 half circles, 1 on each. I darkened them up a bit, and then using my paint pen, I added on 2 dots, and you can always use the back of your paintbrush. I then added 2 eyelashes to the eyes. For my scarecrow's nose, I'm using a thin piece of wood, and you can always use a craft stick, and all I'm doing is cutting out a small triangle. Now that I'm happy with the size, I'm giving it a coat of orange acrylic paint. Now that it's dry, and to attach it, I'm using some hot glue. I then added on the mouth using my paint pen and then some lines to mimic stitching. Now that I'm done, and to add on the scarecrow's hair, I'm starting with a large handful of raffia. I'm also using my finger protector. You can pick these up at the Dollar Tree. They come 3 to a package. And because we're working pretty closely with the hot glue, they'll definitely prevent burns. I'm taking a small handful of the raffia, I'm adding some hot glue to the top of the scarecrow's head, and then attaching it in place. Once that's attached, I'm just continuing on and adding the raffia to the scarecrow's head. While I was adding the raffia, I wasn't super fussy, and once the top was complete, I then turned it around and added some onto the back. When I was done to finish up, I added some hot glue to the back, and then I added some raffia hanging from the top of the head and down over the back. It has some crazy hair going on, and now all I'm doing is using my hot glue gun and attaching the hair to the side of the scarecrow's head. To make the base for my scarecrow, I'm using 12 of the tumbling tower blocks from the Dollar Tree. I'm attaching them together with my Star Bond thick glue. I absolutely love this glue because it sets natural wood up super quick, and I have the company linked below in case you'd like to check it out. Using my glue, I'm now attaching the blocks side by side in rows of 4. With my first row of blocks in place, I'm then adding on my second and third. As I'm adding the blocks together, I'm making sure that the ends all line up evenly. Within about 2 minutes or so, the block has completely set up, so using my orange acrylic paint, I'm giving it a complete coat. Now that it's dry, adding the two together is super easy. I'm just adding some hot glue onto the top of the block and then placing down my scarecrow's head. I'm once again using my glue gun and adding some to the side block, and then just placing down and attaching the raffia hair. After both sides, I then attach the hair to the back of the block. To neaten up the raffia hair, I'm now using my scissors and cutting it flush with the bottom of the base. Once that was done, I then cut all the raffia loops. I'm using a 4-inch straw hat for my scarecrow, and you can pick these up at Hobby Lobby and Michael's, and I think you can even find them at Walmart. To give it a bit of a rustic look, I'm cutting in some irregular V shapes around the outside brim of the hat. And this is just my personal preference. You can always just leave the hat as is. Now that it's all cut on the outside, I'm using my scissors and I'm kind of punching a hole through the top of the hat. I hot glued some raffia inside the hole and then trimmed off the top. To embellish the hat, I'm using a leftover piece of 1/4-inch buffalo check ribbon. I attached the end to the hat, measured the size, I trimmed it off, and then attached the other end. To accent the hat, I'm adding one of the fall leaves from the Dollar Tree and one of their small sunflowers. I'm then adding a hint of green by attaching a simple leaf to the back. To attach it, I just added some hot glue to the top of the scarecrow's head and then just popped it into place. To finish up, I'm using some of the Dollar Tree buffalo check ribbon and making a simple bow. When I was done, I trimmed both tails to the same length. And now all that's left to do is hot glue it to the front of the base. Now that I'm done, this cute scarecrow is ready for my fall tiered tray. I'm starting my fresh apples tree by using 8 of the tumbling tower blocks from the Dollar Tree. Using my glue gun, I'm attaching them together to make a small box. I attached 4 of them together on their sides using my glue gun. With my first layer complete, I'm now adding on my second. Now that the base is complete, I'm recycling an old piece of Sahara floral block that I had originally picked up at the Dollar Tree. I placed my base down on top of it, and then using a knife, I marked out the inside area. When I was done, I then cut out the rectangle. I trimmed off the edges a bit and then slipped it into the base. With both of my pieces attached together, I'm now using some of my sage green acrylic paint and giving it a complete coat. While I was painting it, I did paint over the Sahara floral as well. To attach on my sign, I'm using one of the Dollar Tree chalkboard wood stakes. I used my clippers and I just clipped it free from the stake. Now to add the words fresh apples, you can always just write on the chalkboard tag. I used my Cricut and printed out the word fresh apples. And then I just attached it onto the sign. Using my hot glue gun, I then attached it to the front of the base. To make my apple tree, I'm using a leftover flower stem. It had originally held flowers and I just saved the stem after I used them for another project. To make the apples, I found this beaded pumpkin at the Dollar Tree and I'm going to cut one side off and slip off the beads. You can use as many beads as you'd like. I'm going to use 13 for my project. To paint my beads, I'm first slipping them on to a piece of floral wire. Once they're all in place, I'm then using some red acrylic paint and giving them a complete coat. You can find some small pre-made apples at craft stores. I needed a hole on the bottom of some of my apples, so that's why I'm making mine out of beads. Once they're completely dry, I then slip them off of the wire. For the leaf accents, I have bags and bags of them that are left over from past projects where I used the flowers and I didn't need the leaves. So I went through and I found some little stems and some leaves that I'm going to use for my tree. I cut off one of the stems and I slipped it up through the bead and then trimmed off both the ends. If your leaf doesn't fit snugly inside, just add a little bit of glue to help hold it in place. If you don't have something like this on hand, you can always cut a thin strip out of a leaf and then just follow the same instructions. After I made my first apple, I just continued on and made 12 more. To add on my apples, this tree has some small branches sticking out on the sides, so using my E6000, I'm just adding a little to the end and slipping on an apple. If you don't have little branches on your cut flower stem, not to worry, because I'll be adding those apples next. After I had my apples attached to the branches, I then used my glue gun along with some E6000 and started to add them randomly around the tree. The reason I used hot glue and E6000 is the hot glue will let me attach them in place, and then the E6000, once it sets up, will make sure that they don't move. To add on my leaves and green accent, I'm cutting little pieces of the leaves off of this stem. And when I'm done, I'll have a whole little pile of leaves. To attach the leaves, because they are so much lighter than the apples, I'm only using my E6000. And once again, I'm just kind of placing them here and there and filling out the tree. If you'd like to make a fall tree instead of an apple tree, You can always just omit the apples and add on some multicolored leaves. Once I had all the leaves in place, I then set the tree aside and let it set up for about 2 or 3 hours. When my tree was completely set up, adding it to the fresh apples base was super easy. I just pressed it down in the center. To hide the Sahara foam, I'm using a small amount of the Dollar Tree reindeer moss. I added on some hot glue and then a few pinches of the moss. With that in place, I'm now taking the 3 apples that I had left over, and because the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, I'm placing them right around it. Now that I'm done, this super cute apple tree makes the perfect addition to my tiered tray. To make my pumpkin, I'm using 3 of the regular size canning lids. And if you do any canning, you know that once you use the lid, you pretty much have to throw it away, so this is a great way to recycle them. I'm overlapping the top on one side and then the other. Now that I have my spacing, I'm turning the 2 over and then hot gluing them together. I'm now adding my 3rd lid, making sure the spacing is even on both sides. To make my pumpkin stand up, I'm using 2 of the tumbling tower blocks from the Dollar Tree. I'm adding some hot glue on the back bottom of my pumpkin and placing down 1 of the tumbling tower blocks. With that in place, I'm now adding on some hot glue and then placing on the 2nd. With the added blocks, now your pumpkin can stand up on its own. To turn my pumpkin orange, I'm giving it a heavy coat of this orange spray paint. Now that it's dry, and if you've followed me for a while, you know that I love to splatter, so I'm going to use some of my brown acrylic paint and give it an accent. I placed a small amount on one paintbrush and then tapped away with my 2nd. Now that it's dry, it's time to add on the pumpkin stem, and I just picked this small stick up outside. It kind of had a flat end, so I thought it would work perfect on the pumpkin. To add it, I placed some hot glue on the back and then attached it in place. Now that I'm done, sometimes it's really easy for the metal to scratch, so I used my clear matte spray paint and I gave it a complete coat. I want to make some tendrils for my pumpkin, so I'm using some of the jute from the Dollar Tree. I used a piece of clear tape and attached the end of the jute to my pencil. Now all I'm doing is twisting it around in a spiral. Now that I'm done, I'm attaching this end with a clear piece of tape. To help keep the jute keep its shape, I'm using some Mod Podge. Using my foam brush, I made sure to dab the Mod Podge completely around the pencil. Now that it's dry, I'm just sliding it right off of the pencil. I now have these tight little spirals, so I'm removing the excess from the end and then just kind of pulling them apart. Once I have the length that I want, I'm then cutting it free from the rest. I added some hot glue to the back next to the stem and then just attached it in place. To add on the 2nd tendril, I just followed the same instructions. With those in place, I'm now adding on 2 leaves, and I already had these on hand, but you can use pretty much anything you'd like. I added some hot glue on the back next to the stem and then attached both in place. To finish up, and this step is completely optional, I'm using some of the buffalo check ribbon from the Dollar Tree and making a simple bow. I cut 2 short tails, and then using my glue gun, I attached it at an angle on the top. And with that, these canning jar lids turned into a perfect pumpkin for my tiered tray. To make the ribbon pumpkins, I'm using one of the orange and one of the soft white pumpkins from the Dollar Tree. I'm using a knife and I'm cutting just outside the stem on the pumpkin. When I'm done, I'm then turning the pumpkin over and cutting out the same size on the bottom. With both ends open, I'm then using my knife to make a hole through the center. To wrap my pumpkins, I'm using the Dollar Tree burlap orange and white polka dot ribbons. To wrap the pumpkin, I'm measuring about 1 inch of ribbon inside the opening, then wrapping the ribbon on the outside and cutting the same length on the bottom. For the next step, it is really important that you use a finger protector, and you can pick these up at the Dollar Tree. They usually come in a set of 3. I placed a dot of hot glue inside the pumpkin and then attached the ribbon. I then wrapped it around the outside of the pumpkin, making sure that it was tight, added a dot of hot glue on the bottom, and then attached the ribbon. To add the next piece of ribbon, I just followed the exact same instructions, this time slightly overlapping the first. I continued working my way around both pumpkins, slightly overlapping the ribbon. And now you can see why the finger protector comes in so handy, because that hot glue is super hot. I continued on adding the ribbon to the pumpkins until they were both complete. The hole on the bottom is pretty small, but if you want to cover it, I just cut a matching piece of ribbon into a circle and hot glued it over the opening. To make the leaves for my pumpkins, I'm using some of the Dollar Tree jute. I'm looping about 8 inches of jute, approximately 6 times. When I was done, I then cut an extra piece of jute and wrapped it and tied it around the center. For the white polka dot pumpkin, I followed the same instructions and I made those loops at about 6 inches in length. To attach them, I added some hot glue into the center of the pumpkin and then pushed the jute inside. For the pumpkin stems, I'm using 2 small pieces of wood that I picked up outside. I placed some hot glue in the center of each pumpkin and then pressed the stem inside. And now that I'm done, these 2 cute pumpkins are ready to display. I'm starting my DIY by using a scrap piece of wood that I found in my kindling bin. It's a 2x4 and it measures 3.5 by 3.5 inches. It wasn't in perfect condition, so I used a piece of sandpaper and I filed down the rough edges. I used my white acrylic paint and I gave it a complete coat. When it's completely dry, and because I want my sign to have a bit of a rustic appearance, I'm using a sanding block and I'm sanding around all 4 of the edges. This is completely optional. If you prefer to keep the block white, just omit this step. The Dollar Tree is selling these really cute seasonal rub-on transfer stickers, and I'm going to use this one and attach it onto the wooden block. I removed it from the package, peeled off the protective backing, and then I centered it on my sign. Once I had the sticker in place, I then just used a regular craft stick and I rubbed the transfer down onto the wood. From there, it was so easy. I just removed the sticker backing. It would have taken me a while to make this on my Cricut, but it literally took me less than a minute. To accent my sign, I'm using some of this Dollar Tree buffalo check ribbon. I added a dot of hot glue on the top of my sign and then wrapped the ribbon around. I continued adding a dot of hot glue here and there to help hold the ribbon in place. To embellish the top, I'm using 3 of these pretty fall Dollar Tree leaves. I added a dot of hot glue onto the top corner and attached the leaves. For my pumpkin accent on the top, I'm using one of these little pumpkins, and I found these at the Dollar Tree. I won't need the wire, so I'm just sliding it out of the bottom. I added some hot glue in between the leaves and then attached the pumpkin. For the floral accent, I'm adding on these 3 small yellow and 2 small white flowers that I had left over from a past project. I'm also using a sprig of orange fall grass, and I picked this up at the Dollar Tree. I added some hot glue behind the pumpkin and then attached the grass. When I was done, I then attached the 3 yellow flowers. I didn't have any exact pattern, I just kind of placed them around the leaves. And once I had all the yellow flowers in place, I then attached the 2 white. Now that I have all my flowers in place, I'm going to add on some green leaf accents. I'm cutting a few off of this ivy stem, and these kind of remind me of an actual pumpkin leaf. And once again, I don't have a pre-planned idea of where I'm placing them. I'm just making sure that they're kind of evenly spaced around the top. And now that I have all the leaves in place, this makes the cutest addition to my fall tiered tray. I'm starting my gnome by using a 5-inch pumpkin from the Dollar Tree. I removed the tag and noticed it wasn't standing up perfectly straight and it was kind of leaning to one side. So I used my kitchen knife and I gave the pumpkin a flat bottom. To give the pumpkin a little more stability, I'm using 3 of the tumbling tower blocks from the Dollar Tree. Using my glue gun, I attached the 3 sides of the blocks together. Once they were all attached, I then added some hot glue onto the base and then centered my pumpkin. To cover the gnome's body and to make the arms, I'm using 2 of these gray kid socks from the Dollar Tree. So I used my first gray sock and I just slid it up and over the pumpkin. Then to help hold the sock in place, I cut down the center top and then tied it into a knot. To add the beard on my gnome, I'm using a white Dollar Tree bar cloth. In the past, I've used mop strands and pom-poms and I think a few other things. I can't remember offhand, but if you'd like to check out my other gnomes, I'll have that playlist linked below in my description. To hold the beard together, I'm using a white chenille stem. I'm starting at the corner of the bar cloth and I'm cutting off the finished edge. I'm cutting off the bottom trim at 9 inches and the side at 8. When I'm done, I'm then folding that piece of fabric in half and cutting it free. I'm now opening my fabric up and on the folded line, I'm adding a bead of hot glue. And now I'm placing that white chenille stem right on top of it. With that in place, I'm folding the fabric over and pressing it together. Now carefully, while the glue is still hot, I'm sliding each side of the fabric into the center of the chenille stem. Once it's gathered and you're done, it kind of looks like a little skirt. To mimic the hair, I used my scissors and cut thin strips in the fabric. While I was cutting them, I wasn't super fussy, but I did try to keep the strands about the same width. And I cut the 2 pieces of fabric together up until I met the chenille stem. With my beard complete, I'm adding it to the gnome about 2 to 3 inches down from the top, and I'm wrapping the chenille stems around the sides and then twisting them together on the back. I then added some hot glue under the chenille stems to help hold the beard in place. With his beard attached in place, I'm now going to trim it up using my scissors. I cut the 2 sides at an angle and trimmed around the bottom of the beard. My scissors are really sharp, but I did have to work a bit to get through the folded towel. For my gnome's nose, I'm using a wooden bead that I had on hand. It's a medium size, and sometimes I paint them, but I like the natural color, so I'm just going to leave this one as is. To attach it, I'm placing a dot of hot glue in the center of the beard, just above the chenille stem, and then attaching the bead in place. For my gnome's hat, I'm using a black sock from the men's department at Dollar Tree. I made sure that the heel section on the sock was on the back, and then I slipped the sock over the gnome's head. I then pulled each of the sides down next to the beard. To attach the sock to my gnome, I pulled back the fabric over the nose, added on a line of hot glue, and then attached the fabric back in place. I'm going to be adding on some arms, so I'm attaching the hat, working my way about an inch or so back from the beard. I added on some hot glue and attached both sides at an angle. To fill out my gnome's hat and give it a little bit of body, I'm using a handful of polyfill. I stuffed it up under the back of the hat and filled out about 4 inches or so. This step is completely optional. You can always just leave the hat as is. To make the gnome's arms, I'm using the second gray sock from the pair. I opened the sock up, I laid it flat and cut directly down the center. The inside of the sock are going to be the outside of my arms because there's a little decorative edge where they had sewn the socks together. When I was done, I then cut off the toe part and left myself about 4 inches of sock. I added a line of hot glue on one side and folded the fabric over. I then added on more hot glue and continued to fold the fabric over, adding hot glue until I rolled the fabric so it looked kind of like an arm. When my first one was complete, I then made my second. As you're rolling the fabric, the ends become uneven, so I ended up cutting them straight off at about the 4-inch mark. To attach them, I pulled up the side of the hat next to the beard and added on some hot glue. I then placed down the arm and pulled the hat over the end. With my first arm in place, I then attached the second. I'm going to have my gnome hold a small apple, and I found one on a fall Dollar Tree pick. I removed it, added some hot glue to the gnome's hand, and pressed it in place. I then added some hot glue to the other hand and pressed it against the apple. To give my gnome some easy feet, I'm using one of the heart-shaped chalkboard tags that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. I added on some hot glue and then pressed down the gnome. To embellish his hat, I'm using some of this Farmhouse ribbon that I picked up at Michael's. They do sell it at Dollar Tree. I couldn't find it at mine, and I'm wrapping it around the gnome's hat and then making a bow. Once I had it the right size, I then trimmed off the tails. I'm adding on a red leaf and a berry pick from the Dollar Tree. I added on some hot glue where the top of the hat folds over and attached the leaf, and then I added on the berries. And now that I'm done, I'm adding on one more of the small Dollar Tree fall leaves and tucking it up under the red leaf and attaching it in place. To finish up, I'm folding over the end of the sock using the same buffalo check ribbon. I'm tying it off into a simple bow. Now that I'm done, this sweet little gnome holding an apple is ready for my tiered tray. To make my sweet cider house, I'm using one of the small wooden cutouts from the Dollar Tree. I'm then using my white acrylic paint and I'm giving it a complete coat. With my house dry, I want to give the edges a bit of a smoky accent, so I'm using a pencil. I'm sketching along the outside edge of the house and then just kind of rubbing it in with my finger. Adding on this accent is completely optional. It's just personal preference, and if you would prefer a bright white house, just omit this step. I'm adding a roof onto my house, but this step is completely optional. I'm using 3 of the wooden clothespins from the Dollar Tree. I'm turning them into the roof, and I need 6 individual pieces, so I'm pulling them all apart. I'm attaching 2 sets of 3 together, and I'm using my Starbond thick glue, which I love because it sets up wood projects super quick. And all I'm doing is adding some to the side of each clothespin and attaching them together. While you're attaching them, you will see that there's a little line, and that's where the metal support was, so that makes it easy for you to line them up. Now when I'm placing these down on the house, there's a little hole that will show up, and that's where they were attached together. so I'm going to use one of the skewers from the Dollar Tree to fill in the hole. I cut 2 short pieces of skewer to fit in the length of the holes. I then added in my Starbond thick glue, placed in the skewers, and then tapped them into place. The Starbond thick glue sets up super quick, usually within 2 to 3 minutes. And if you would like to try this glue out, I do have the company linked below in my description. Now that they're set up, you can see there's a little overhang on the sides and a little bit on the top, so I'm going to use my heavy grit paper and just kind of sand them down a bit. Now that the edges and the tops of my roof are smooth, I'm going to give them a coat of red acrylic paint. And I did make sure to paint both the top and the bottom. With my 2 roof pieces dry, I'm adding them to the house by placing some hot glue on the top of the form. I then attach the pieces flat side down with the flat ends pointing to the peak of the roof. I also made sure that while I was attaching them, they both were centered. For the apple accent on my house, I'm using one of these wooden cutouts from the Dollar Tree. And then once again, to match the roof, I'm using the same red acrylic paint and giving it a coat. When I was done with the apple, I then used some dark green acrylic paint and painted the leaves, and I'm actually going to be covering these, but just in case it would show through, I figured I'd give it a coat. So just like I added the accent on the house, I'm once again using my pencil and accenting the apple. I'm rubbing the edge of the pencil around the outside of the apple and then rubbing it in with my finger. And once again, this step is completely optional. To add on the wording Sweet Cider House, I printed it out on my Cricut and added it to the apple. And if you don't have a Cricut, you can always use some of the sticker letters. I saw a huge assortment of really cool ones at Michael's. They come in different styles and colors, so you could always use those instead. To add the apple onto my house, I'm just adding on some hot glue and then centering it in the middle. Before the hot glue dries that has popped through the little hanger hole, I'm adding on a silk leaf and I'm just folding it in half and placing it onto the apple. I'm adding on a ribbon accent to my house and I'm using this black and white check that I picked up at Michael's. I wrapped it around the house to get my size, I cut it, and then I hot glued it into place. For the bow accent, I'm using some black and white gingham ribbon, and then I'm just making a simple bow. When I was done, I then cut both tails at the same length at an angle. To attach it, I added some hot glue onto the leaf, and then attached my bow in place. And with that, this sweet cider house is the perfect addition to my tiered tray. For my home sign, I'm using a 10-inch piece of the Dollar Tree wood, and I'm cutting it down to 6 inches and then giving it a coat of white acrylic paint. Now that the paint is dry, I'm going to use my pencil to add on an accent. I'm rubbing the side of my pencil on the outside edges of the sign, and then I'm just kind of rubbing it in with my fingers. I worked my way around the sign until all 4 sides had a smoky accent. Now that I'm done, I'm adding on a 1.5-inch buffalo check ribbon, and I had picked this up at Michael's. I wrapped it around my sign and then cut it to size. I added on some hot glue and attached it to my sign, making sure to center it on the wood. I'm using the buffalo check ribbon for my sign, but I think any style of ribbon would work for this sign. With my ribbon attached in place, I'm using some of these wooden letters from the Dollar Tree. I'm using the letters HME, and I'm giving them a coat of my white acrylic paint. Now that the paint is completely dry, I'm once again using my pencil and giving my letters the same accent as I gave the sign. I'm rubbing it along the outside edges, and when I'm done, I'm rubbing it in with my finger. If you can't find these wooden letters at Dollar Tree, you can always use your Cricut or even some stick-on letters. I think these letters would look great in black as well, and then you would just omit this step. Instead of using the letter O in my sign, I'm using one of these small sunflowers from the Dollar Tree. Attaching everything together is super easy. I'm first finding the placement and the spacing on the sign. I removed the stem from the back of the flower. And now, using my glue gun, I'm attaching the letters and the flower onto my sign. You could always change up the sunflower to a heart or a snowflake, and this sign would work for all different occasions. Now that everything's in place, this sweet home sign is ready for my tiered tray. To make my canning lid apples, I'm actually recycling 2 lids I had left over from past preserves. I'm making 2 different size apples, so I'm using a large one and a small one. To help make them stand up, I'm using 4 tumbling tower blocks, 3 that are the regular size, and then 1 that's just a bit shorter so it will fit behind the smaller apple. I used my glue gun and I attached and stacked the 3 tumbling tower blocks. I added some hot glue onto the side and then attached it to the back of my canning jar lid. For the smaller apple, I'm using the shorter tumbling tower block, and I'm attaching that to the back. I'm then attaching the smaller apple to the larger by adding some hot glue onto the back of the block and then slightly offsetting it against the larger apple. To turn my apples red, I'm using some of this apple red spray paint, and I'm giving both the front and the back a complete coat. Now that it's painted, sometimes the paint will scratch off of the metal, so what I like to do is give it a coat of Mod Podge, and that kind of seals it on a little more permanent. So using my paintbrush, I'm just giving the front and the back a complete coat. I let it dry completely, and now I'm going to add on the apple stems. And believe it or not, I have an apple tree in my yard and it dropped this branch, so I used my cutters and cut off 2 apple stems. Along with my glue gun, I'm using some E6000 to help hold the stems in place. I'm adding some hot glue to the back of my large apple and then following it up with the E6000, and once again, the hot glue will hold the stem in place and the E6000 will make sure it doesn't move once it sets up. With the larger apple complete, I then followed the same instructions and attached the stem to the smaller one. Now that they've set up for a couple of hours, it's time to add on the leaves. I'm actually using one leaf from my stash and I'm cutting it into 3 pieces. I'm starting with the smaller apple, adding some hot glue to the back stem, and then attaching on the leaf. For my larger apple, I added a little hot glue to the front of the stem and attached the leaf, and then I added some more hot glue to the back of the stem and attached my second leaf. I'm giving both of my apples an accent, and I'm using this pretty black and white check ribbon that I picked up at Michael's. I made 2 simple bows the same size and cut about 2-inch tails. When I was done, I then used my glue gun and attached one to the front of each stem. And with that, my canning lid apples are complete and ready to display. I'm starting my project by using one of the plastic tubs, and you can find this in the toy department at the Dollar Tree. I'm also using a piece of floral foam, and you can pick this up at the Dollar Tree as well. They come in white and green, and I just so happen to have a leftover piece of white, so I'm using that for this project. I placed the block in the tub, and the tub has rounded edges, so using my knife, I'm just cutting away to make it fit inside the tub. Now that the bottom fits, I'm cutting off the top so I have a nice flat base. With my piece of foam now cut to the correct size, I'm attaching it inside the tub using my hot glue gun. As an accent on the outside of the tub, I'm using this pretty sunflower ribbon. It's 1 inch and I picked it up at Hobby Lobby. I wrapped it around my tub to get my measurement and gave myself an extra 3 inches. Now using my hot glue gun, I attached the ribbon around the outside of the tub. To finish up, I glued the 2 ends together on the end of the tub. I gave myself the extra ribbon so that they could overlap just a bit, and then I cut off the excess with my scissors. For the sunflowers in my tub, I'm using 3 of these metal sunflowers that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. And what I love about these is the head of the flower is actually on a little spring, and it just kind of bobbles around a little bit. I want my sunflowers to be at different heights, so I just tried the tub up against them to decide the length. Now that all 3 stems are cut, I'm adding them into the tub. And then to be sure they don't move, I'm adding some hot glue to each stem. The tub is lightweight and I want to give it a little more stability, so I'm using some of these glass beads that I had picked up at the Dollar Tree. And then all I did was add some to each end of the tub. To cover the white floral block, I'm using some of this reindeer moss that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. I added some hot glue onto the top of the foam and then sprinkled on the moss. This is what I chose to use, but honestly, you can use anything that you'd like to hide that floral foam. When I was adding the moss, I didn't load it up because I do want to kind of mimic water, and I'm using 4 of these blue leaves off of this Dollar Tree leaf and pumpkin stem. To attach them, I just added some hot glue onto the moss and then placed down the leaves. This was so easy and inexpensive to make, and I think it's a unique piece for my fall bath decor, and I just love those little sunflowers because they're just so springy and cute. To finish up this project, I'm using the same sunflower ribbon, and I'm making a simple bow. I used my glue gun and attached it to the front of the tub. And with that, my sunflowers in a bathtub are ready to display. To make my fall gnome, I'm using a piece of wood that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. It measures about 10 inches in length and it's about 3/4 of an inch wide. I'm making a mini gnome, so I cut a piece 4 inches in length and using some white acrylic paint, I gave it a complete coat. Now that the paint is dry, I'm going to make the beard. I'm using this Dollar Tree mop head for my gnome's beard, and I'm cutting off 8 full strands. With them cut, I'm lining one up next to the other. To help attach the beard together, I'm using a white chenille stem and I'm cutting it in half. I folded my first strand over to find the center. Then using my glue gun, I placed a line of hot glue right down the middle. I then placed my chenille stem in the glue. From there, I then folded the left strands over the chenille stem and onto the right. This is the beginning of your gnome's beard, and you can leave it like this if you want. I like to open mine up so it's fuller. If you prefer a fuller beard, like I do, all you do, it's super easy, is just gently pull those strands apart. With the beard complete and to attach it, I'm using my hot glue gun and adding some hot glue in the shape of a smile about 1 inch down from the top of the wood. I'm then attaching the beard into place. I'm folding the 2 ends of the chenille stem onto the top and then adding on some hot glue to hold them in place. As you can see, the beard is definitely too long, but this is the fun part. I'm trimming up the sides at an angle and the bottom, making sure that it pretty much is flush with the bottom of the wood. For my gnome's nose, I'm using a wooden bead that I already had on hand, but if you don't have any of these, you can always paint one of the styrofoam vase fillers from the Dollar Tree or one of their pearls. To attach the nose, I'm adding a dot of hot glue on the wood in the center just above the beard and then attaching the nose in place. For the gnome's hat and arms, I'm using this pair of gray baby socks that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. It was basically the only color that I could find that would kind of work with a fall theme. To attach it to the gnome, you want to make sure that the heel is in the back and you're adding on the top part of the sock. And then all I did was just slide it over the top of the gnome's head. To help hold it in place, I lifted up the sock over the gnome's nose and added a dot of hot glue, and then I just replaced the hat. I then added some hot glue on the 2 sides and pulled the hat down at an angle. I want my gnome's hat to have a bit of height, so I'm using 2 cotton balls, and you can use anything you have on hand, and I'm stuffing them up the back of the hat. To help the hat stand up straight, I added some hot glue to the back, and then I pulled the back of the hat down tightly and held it in place until the hot glue had cooled. To make the gnome's arms, I cut the other gray sock in half so I have 2 equal sides. The outside of the sock is gray, but the inside has a white stripe where they had band them together. So I'm using the inside of the sock because I think it makes a cute accent. I added some hot glue to the top of the sock, and then using my finger protector, I rolled it together tightly. I then added some hot glue on the seam and pinched the fabric together. It's not going to look perfect, but don't worry about it because that uneven, kind of messy edge is going to end up being hidden. With my first arm complete, I followed the same instructions and made the second. I then used my scissors to cut off the uneven ends. To attach both arms, I'm adding some hot glue under the hat, then tucking the end of the arm up under it. I then turn the gnome around and attach the second arm. My gnome's holding a pumpkin, and I found these at the Dollar Tree. There's usually 6. I did use the others for another project. To attach it, I added some hot glue to the end of each hand, and then just attach them to the pumpkin. For my gnome's feet, I'm using some of these wooden hearts from the Dollar Tree. They were left over from Valentine's Day, and you can just use any type of little heart that you have on hand. I'm adding some hot glue onto the heart, and I'm using the natural wood color because it matches his nose, and then I'm just placing him on top. I'm adding a really simple accent to his hat, and I'm using some of this white cord that I had on hand. I cut a short piece, and then I gathered the top of the gnome's hat into a point. I then wrapped the cord around the hat a couple of times and tied it off in a knot. I snipped off the excess tails, and then using the same cord, I just made a simple bow. I added on a dot of hot glue and then attached it in place. And with that, my mini gnome with a pumpkin is complete. To make my fall pumpkin sign, I'm starting with this wooden toy that I picked up in the toy department at the Dollar Tree. It measures 6 inches by 2 inches, so if you can't find this toy, you can always cut a piece of wood. I want to cover the back side, and I have a really thin piece of wood, so I've cut it to size, and I'm going to use my Starbond thick glue. I have that company linked below in case you'd like to try it out, and I'm attaching it to the back. The glue sets up in just a couple of minutes, so once it's dry, I'm using some of my sage green acrylic paint, and I'm giving it a complete coat. Now that it's dry, I'm using a piece of sandpaper, and I'm sanding off the edges to give it a bit more of a rustic appearance. I'm adding on the word fall, and I printed mine out on my Cricut. You can also paint the word on, or you can pick up some stickers. I picked these up at Michael's, and they have a huge assortment, and those would work great too. When I printed out the word fall, I made sure to leave about a 2-inch space between the F and the L, and then I centered it on the wood. As you can see, the letter A is missing from my word fall. In place of it, I'm using one of these small pumpkins from the Dollar Tree, and they're made out of styrofoam. They have a wired end, and I'm just snipping it off. I'm cutting the pumpkin in half, and I'm leaving the stem on one side, and I'm using a razor blade, but use anything that you're comfortable cutting with, and when you're doing it, just make sure that you're super careful. Now that I have 2 halves, I'm using the side with the stem, and I'm adding some hot glue to the back. And now I'm centering the pumpkin between the F and the L. I'm now adding on one of the whole pumpkins. I added some hot glue onto the top of my sign and just attached it in place. And now it's ready for my tiered tray. I'm using one of the small wooden boxes from the Dollar Tree to display my farmhouse pumpkins. I wanted to give it a little height, so I'm adding on 2 of the Dollar Tree tumbling tower blocks as legs. To attach them, I'm using my Starbond thick glue. I absolutely love it because it sets up natural wood in like 2 to 3 minutes. And if you'd like to try it out yourself, I do have the company linked below. I turned the box over and added the Starbond glue to the tumbling tower blocks and then attached them in place. After a couple of minutes, it was set up, so now I'm using my white acrylic paint and giving it a complete coat. I wanted to place a small sign inside the box, and as an alternative to using my Cricut, I went to Canva and made up a small sign, and I'll have that linked below in the description in case you'd like to use it for your project. To attach it, I used my glue stick. I placed a generous amount on the back and then attached it inside the cover. As an accent to the box, I'm using some of this farmhouse ribbon that I picked up at Michael's. I added some hot glue to the back of the box and then attached the ribbon. From there, I continued adding glue and attaching the ribbon around the box. When I was done, I then used the same ribbon and made a simple bow. I trimmed off the tails and then using my hot glue gun, I attached it to the side of the box. To fill it, I'm using 3 orange and 2 black mini fabric pumpkins from the Dollar Tree. I added each of them into place, and this makes the cutest accent on my tiered tray. Well, here we are at the end of the video, and I really hope you enjoyed making these fall DIYs with me. I have more seasonal home decor ideas, and I'll link them for you at the end of this video, or you can find them in my description below. If you enjoyed hanging out with me, don't forget to click that little red subscribe button below. I hope you all have an amazing day, and I will see you soon. Bye, everybody!